200 years ago, a British soldier retired to a patch of Ontario farmland and built a house so small, so smart, and so cheap that people are still copying it today. No power tools, no trusses shipped from a warehouse, no YouTube tutorials, just a low-hipped roof, a wraparound porch, and a floor plan so efficient that modern tiny house designers are quietly stealing from it in 2026. This is the Ontario Regency Cottage, and by the end of this video you will understand why this forgotten 19th century design might be the smartest tiny home blueprint hiding in plain sight. Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we are breaking down historic and alternative housing styles like this one every single week. And trust me, the ending of this video has a detail about these cottages that almost nobody talks about. All right, let us get into it. So what exactly is a Regency cottage? The style traces back to England around 1811, during the reign of the Prince Regent, later King George IV. British architecture at the time was borrowing heavily from the colonies, blending neoclassical lines with Gothic touches, and even chinoiserie influences pulled from India and the Caribbean, where many British officers had been stationed. When those officers retired to Upper Canada in the early 1800s, they brought that aesthetic with them, and it landed in Ontario sometime between 1830 and 1860. The result was a small, symmetrical 1 to 1.5 story house with a low-pitched hipped roof, tall, thin windows that almost touched the ground, and a broad veranda wrapping around one or more sides. The proportions were simple. No heavy ornamentation, no wasted material, just clean, classical lines that did a lot with very little. Historian Harold Kalman described it as having an intimate relationship with the landscape, often picturesque and often built near water. Here is the part that matters for us. This was not a mansion style being shrunk down. It was designed small from the start, for settlers with limited resources who needed a home that was fast to build, cheap to heat, and comfortable despite its size. It sounds familiar. That is the exact brief every tiny house YouTuber is chasing right now. They just did not have that name for it in 1835, and it did not stay static. As the decades passed, the pure Regency form gradually absorbed local influence and started shifting into what historians now call the Ontario cottage, and eventually picked up Gothic revival trim as that style swept the province. We will come back to why that evolution matters, because it explains why so many of these houses are hiding in plain sight across small-town Ontario right now, misidentified as plain old farmhouses. 3 design decisions made the Regency Cottage punch above its weight, and all 3 are still gold standard tiny house strategy in 2026. First, the low-hipped roof. A hip roof sheds snow and wind from all 4 sides instead of just 2, which matters enormously in Ontario winters. It also lowers the visual bulk of the home, so a small footprint does not read as cramped from the outside. Builders today use the exact same trick on modern tiny homes to make a 300 square foot structure look proportioned instead of boxy. Less roof surface exposed to wind also means less thermal bridging at the eaves, which is a fancy way of saying the house loses heat slower, something 1830s builders could not measure with a thermal camera but clearly understood by instinct and experience. Second, the wraparound veranda. This was not decoration. A covered porch extends your usable living space in 3 seasons without adding a single square foot of heated interior, which keeps both material costs and heating bills down. In a tiny home, where every square foot inside costs real money to heat and insulate, pushing living space outdoors under cover is one of the smartest moves you can make, and the Regency Cottage figured that out 2 centuries before insulation ratings were even a conversation. The veranda also worked as a buffer zone, shading the tall windows from direct summer sun while still letting in low-angle winter light, which is passive solar design before the term existed. Third, tall windows set almost a grade. These cottages used oversized glazing to flood a small footprint with natural light and create a visual connection to the outdoors, making a tiny interior feel far larger than its actual dimensions. That is basically the entire philosophy behind modern tiny house window design, just achieved with 1830s glass technology instead of today's triple-pane low E units. Cross ventilation was another built-in advantage. Tall windows on opposing walls let a breeze pull straight through the house, which was the only air conditioning available, and it worked well enough that people kept using the trick for the next 150 years. The classic layout was a symmetrical 5-bay front, meaning 5 evenly spaced openings across the front facade, typically a center door flanked by 2 windows on each side. Inside, the plan was usually a simple center hall with a room on either side, sometimes with a half-story tucked under the roofline for sleeping space, accessed by a narrow stair. Wings were frequently added later as families grew or finances allowed, which is a build now, expand later approach that modern expandable tiny house designers are essentially reinventing under a different name. The related Ontario Cottage variant added a single gable above the center door, which later picked up Gothic detailing as that style overtook Regency influence by the mid-1800s. If you have ever driven through small-town Ontario and noticed a modest 1.5-story farmhouse with a pointed gable dead center over the front door, you have seen this lineage in person, whether you knew the name for it or not. Let's talk about money, because this channel does not do vague estimates, and we want these figures to actually hold up against what contractors are quoting right now. If you wanted to build a Regency Cottage-inspired tiny home in Ontario today, most builds in the 150 to 400 square foot range still land somewhere between $65,000 and $180,000 for the structure itself. But the honest breakdown depends heavily on whether you're building on wheels or on a permanent foundation. A tiny house on wheels, or a basic shell build, typically runs $65,000 to $110,000. A permanent foundation build, the kind you would need for a garden suite or a full-time year-round Regency-inspired cottage, usually starts closer to $120,000 and can climb past $200,000 once municipal connections are factored in. Per square foot, that works out to roughly $200 to $350 for a turnkey contractor build, or closer to $150 per square foot if you are handling part of the labor yourself and going the owner-builder route. That is a meaningful range, so do not let a contractor quote you $150 per square foot for a fully finished, code-compliant, for-season home, because that number usually belongs to a bare shell, not a move-in ready cottage. Compare that to a standard custom detached home build in Ontario right now, which easily runs $375 to $550 per square foot once you factor in standard sizing, labor, and site work. You are still looking at a fraction of the total footprint and a lower cost per square foot stacked on top of each other, which is exactly why a small footprint build like this pencils out so much better in the current market. On top of the structure itself, budget $2,000 to $5,000 for basic municipal building permits, plus another $1,500 to $3,000 if you need stamped engineering drawings for a permanent foundation. Here is the number a lot of tiny home videos leave out entirely. If you are building in a larger municipality or anywhere in the Greater Toronto area, development charges and utility hookup fees can add another $10,000 to $30,000 or more on top of everything else for a foundation build. That is not a small line item, and it is the single biggest reason two people can build what looks like the exact same cottage and end up with wildly different final bills. Always call your local township before you fall in love with a floor plan, because the cost of getting water, sewer, and power to a permanent foundation varies dramatically depending on where you're building. The veranda, by the way, is not just historically accurate, it is a budget hack. Covered outdoor square footage typically costs a fraction of fully insulated, wired, and plumbed interior square footage, so leaning into that wraparound porch the way the original builders did stretches your budget further than adding an equivalent amount of interior space would. If you're trying to land at the lower end of that range, instead of the upper end, a few decisions matter more than any other line item. Roof complexity is the big one. A simple hip roof with no dormers or valleys is dramatically cheaper to frame and shingle than a broken-up roofline with multiple angles, and the Regency Cottage form already gives you that simplicity built in. Window count and size also swing your budget hard in either direction. Oversized glazing looks beautiful, and it is historically accurate to the style, but glass is one of the more expensive line items per square foot, so a builder working on a tighter budget might reduce window size slightly, while keeping the placement and proportions that make the style read correctly. Foundation type is another major swing factor. A full poured concrete foundation with a basement will cost significantly more than a slab on grade or a pier and beam foundation. And for a tiny footprint, many builders are choosing the lighter foundation systems specifically to keep that line item under control. Finally, interior finish level is where people blow their budget without realizing it. A basic but well-built shell with mid-range finishes can sit comfortably in that $200 to $250 per square foot range, while custom millwork, high-end kitchens, and premium flooring can push you toward $350 per square foot or higher, even on a small home. You do not need to build a museum replica to use this design language. Modern builders working in the small and tiny home space are already borrowing Regency proportions without necessarily calling it that. A low hip or gable roof to reduce visual mass. A full or partial wraparound porch to extend living space affordably. Symmetrical window placement to maximize natural light without blowing the window budget. And a simple rectangular footprint that keeps framing costs low because you are not paying a premium for complex roof lines or jogs in the exterior walls. If you're drawing up your own build, the Regency Cottage gives you a genuinely field-tested template. It survived Ontario winters for 2 centuries using nothing but proportion, roof geometry, and smart use of covered outdoor space. That is a design that has already been stress-tested by the harshest client review possible, which is time. Now here is the detail I promised you at the start, and it is the reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. Most people assume the tiny house movement started in the 2000s, maybe traced back to the small house society or the post-2008 financial crisis when Americans started rethinking mortgage debt. But the Ontario Regency Cottage was solving the exact same problem: small footprint, low cost, fast to build, comfortable despite its size, almost 200 years earlier for the exact same reason. Settlers arriving with limited capital needed shelter that worked immediately, not shelter that impressed the neighbors. The tiny house movement did not invent this idea. It rediscovered it. Every trend you see today, expandable add-on wings, porch as bonus square footage, symmetrical window walls for natural light on a budget, all of it already existed on Ontario farmland before Canada was even fully confederated. The style eventually evolved into the Ontario cottage and then got absorbed into the Gothic revival wave that swept the province by the 1860s, which is why so many of these original homes are misidentified today. If you have ever seen a small 1.5-story farmhouse with a low roof and a full porch and assumed it was just an old farmhouse, there's a real chance you were looking at a 200-year-old tiny home blueprint and did not even know it, sitting there quietly proving the entire modern movement right 2 centuries in advance. If this changed how you look at small-town Ontario architecture, or if you're seriously considering a build inspired by this style, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into historic and alternative housing styles like this. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next one, and check the description for related builds we have already covered on this channel. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.